Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another podcast edition of Create Yourself Imagery, Intimacy, Innovation, a place where people from all walks of life in various backgrounds come to share their transformative personal and professional stories of restoration, confidence, education, clarity, and empowerment. They're here to share their helpful tools, resources, and affirming guidance. I'm Joyce Kiles, your global speaker, author, trainer, coach, and consultant. You are ready to transition, transform, and thrive. This is indeed the podcast for you. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome new listeners. If you are returning to the show, welcome back. We're always so pleased to have you to return. And as I always say, tell a friend to tell two other friends about the Create Yourself podcast. We have great guests. This week is no exception. I always share with you all that I am very intentional and specific about the people that I ask to come on the show because I know that their stories, their information, their transitions, their transformations, the way that they thrive and move in the communities, in the world, personally and professionally, they're always going to give us great gems, always great information. Their journeys are powerful and interesting and engaging. This young lady, I had the wonderful pleasure and privilege of getting to know several years ago in a different environment, different space. And we had a similar connection in a whole different field of work from what either of us are currently doing. But we continue to stay in touch over the years, off and on. Her work is phenomenal. She is just a beautiful person, a God-fearing woman, a woman of passion and purpose. So much that she has to offer. And I'm just really, truly excited that she gave me a yes and said she would be a guest on the show. So I'm going to introduce to some and present to others none other than Brenda Torres-Wells, founder of Memory Care Consulting LLC. And when I say she has a lot of other credentials and letters behind her name, she has them and they are credible. She stands on them. She lives by them. She's just an awesome, wonderful human being. So, Brenda, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Joyce, for having me.
So I'm just gonna, jump right into the conversation. And I like to always start by asking our clients, excuse me, not clients, but our guests to please share a bit about themselves. The information about who you are, your bio is listed underneath the podcast itself. But I just love to have our guests in their own words tell us about who they are and what they do and how they started on their Create Yourself journey. So, for the next few minutes, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you again, Joyce. And I just like to start that my journey as a born and raised New Yorker hasn't been a straight line. It's been a blend of artistry, advocacy, and human connection. But more significantly, I was raised in Manhattan, and that distinction really matters. I grew up within walking distance from Central Park, the Museum of Natural History, and the Theater District. So from a very early age, I was surrounded by culture, movement, storytelling, and expression. And I didn't even realize then, but that environment was shaping me. It shaped me how I understood people, how I experienced creativity, and how I even connected meaning to everyday life. So when I eventually entered into therapeutic recreation, it didn't feel like something new. It actually felt like an extension of who I already was. I actually started in fashion. I studied in French Fashion Academy in Soho, designing evening wear and especially wedding gowns. That was my specialty. And what that taught me was how to design emotional experiences and how people feel, how they remember, but more importantly, how they connect. I also was a dancer and even a party promoter, so movement and rhythm have always been part of who I am. I also was exposed to the healthcare very early, learning and interning at NYU at the age of 12. And then by 14, the age of 14, I was already involved in advocacy. Speaking up about some concerns in my neighborhood led me to work alongside with leaders like Ruth Messenger and Gail Brewer, who were former Manhattan Borough presidents, as an intern. That's where I found my voice, Joyce, standing up for others. Over time, my creative background merged into therapeutic recreation, and I realized that art, music, and movement are not just activities, they are always a way to connect. So, for the past 4 years, I've been serving as an educator with the Alzheimer's Association, providing community education and supporting caregivers. So, I've spoken at symposiums, including currently, I'm serving on the Philadelphia Caregivers Committee, where I will also be presenting this year's in Philadelphia at their next symposium. So today, as a dementia educator and founder of Memory Care Consulting, I bring all of those layers together: creativity, advocacy, strategy, and of course, heart. And ultimately, my work is about helping people feel seen, valued, and connected, no matter where they are in their journey.
Wow, such a beautiful, beautiful path that you've been on and continuing to journey on. You know, one of the things that I love that you shared is how art, music, movement, all these things tie in together. Uh, and so your background, your history, and I think that's an important part to lift up is that sometimes people feel that if they're in a particular genre or a particular space of work, that if they decide to do something new or different, or if they feel purposed to do something different, that what they brought to the table prior may not be fitting. And you are showing in this, just all that you've already shared, you're showing how you've been able to merge your passions, the things that you enjoy, things that you were a part of you since early on. I mean, to be an intern at 12 is amazing, I think. The fact that you started in fashion and you understood the emotional experience of wedding gowns and design, like those things matter. So I'm really hopeful that our listeners take in early on that, whatever it is that you've done, those things can be pulled together. Nothing is wasted, is what I want to say. Everything has a purpose, and you are clearly demonstrating that in what you do.
Thank you.
So with that, let's just delve in a bit more. You did talk about, some of the things that you do already, but feel free if there are others that you'd want to elaborate on more. We definitely want to hear them. And we also want to know more about, some of the things that you found most gratifying and then some things that you may find a bit disheartening about what you do.
Sure. Now, I know that one thing that led me to this field, it was a blend, like you mentioned before, of creativity and advocacy. But I've always been fascinated by understanding people, from fashion to dance to working with artists. Then therapeutic recreation brought everything together. Even when memory changes, the person stays the same, is what I have experienced in working with a lot of seniors, especially that have been diagnosed with dementia and Alzheimer's.
So with that, I really want to talk about this, the therapeutic recreation piece of it all. I think because I too, now I don't have a business in it the same way that you do, but I am a volunteer for the Alzheimer's Association in Tennessee.
Hmm.
And so having also, people close to me who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, with dementia, I truly understand and have a personal appreciation for the work that you do. So when you talk about therapeutic recreation, I would just love for you to share with our audience, a bit more about what that means and how that can be implemented. Um, because what I see is it's not even just in the space of uh, Alzheimer's and dementia, but what does therapeutic recreation look like for those who may not be experiencing that?
Well, therapeutic recreation is very broad in general. However, we work with dimensions, and they include like emotional, cognitive, social, physical, and spiritual dimensions, or we call them domains. Now, of course, others have included intellectual stimulation as well. So when we create programs or we designed an initiative, we incorporate these dimensions within the person's lifestyle. And of course, if they've been compromised due to age or cognitive decline, we tend to modify the experience. It's really important to what we call get to know who you serve, their life stories, because their life stories and their lifestyles will help us to design. I call it design. Some people call it program development, but I love to use design as a designer. So in that, I also want to add that I'm also a certified dementia practitioner and a trainer. So I've added that credential to my my what we call experience, but it meant more to me because I needed to expand on understanding the fragmented, what we call cognition of those that we serve. And so, right now, therapeutic recreation works wonderfully. It complements each other because when we're engaging with someone who has dementia, we're engaging with their story because everyone has a story.
Absolutely, and very well said. I'm so pleased that you use words like design. It just gives it a different feel when we think about, our practice and how we show up in our business. So I love that you use that word, that you really do have a care and concern for humanity and making sure that you're standing up and speaking up for those who may not be in a position to do so. I applaud that, and anyone who has followed your work, and certainly those who will after listening to the podcast, they'll have an opportunity to see just how deeply you go into your service and how much you care.
Thank you. Well, currently, what I'm doing now is that I provide education, training, and development programs on dementia, like the Alzheimer's disease and dementia care certification seminar. So I do provide the preliminary service that qualifies those that are interested or those who qualify to become certified dementia practitioners, the initial seminar, so that they can understand the modules of the different elements of what it takes to understand what dementia is. So it is like a full day seminar, and it's been wonderful to see and meet those individuals. Like I have met a lot of nursing, social workers. This is great also for executive directors, administrators, but even more importantly, people don't realize that I even um, I'm giving the seminar to police officers and firefighters and also chaplains because they too have to understand who they're serving because sometimes they are serving someone who has some cognitive deficiency. And in case, of course, like in an emergency, how would you be able to handle someone who may not be able to respond with the timely needs, of course, in an emergency? Or in the right, what we call normalcy of someone who can be guided with instructions. So it has been very interesting to provide this service, teaching the connections, guiding also the caregivers to shift from task orientation care to relationship centered approach. That's where dignity lives.
Oh, that is so powerful. And I'm really glad to hear you share how widespread your training and your education and opportunities for learning goes, and especially lifting up the caregivers. I think a lot of times uh, when we're talking about this work, we don't take full account of all that caregivers go through on this journey. Like it can be very daunting for them. So the fact that you're providing resources, tools, understanding, I think is just invaluable.
Yes, I am very passionate about when it comes to caregivers, as I seen my mother become a caregiver for my father, and I understand that there needed to be some what we call balance. And in my practice now, I love to speak to the caregivers when I'm invited as a guest speaker when they're having events, because I think that they have to learn about being compassion driven in their practice, because of course many tend to feel burdened or not actually understanding the disease of Alzheimer's or dementia. And of course that's an umbrella of 100 types of dementia. So they need to know the basics, and then they also need to become empathetic and have compassion, because sometimes it does become where we question, does the burden provide you um, an outlet? Do you have a way to get to the resources? That's why when we're going to be hosting this symposium, which I'm going to be the speaker, I've done it before where I'm able to engage the audience and allow them to understand there's a lot of things you can do, activities, engagement that you can do with your resident, that you can share moments, because you have to get to know who you serve. They have their own rhythms, they have their own stories, and we are actually their guest. And once they understand that, it becomes what we call a humanistic care instead of just becoming just a caregiver. So, the Alzheimer's Association also provides a lot of resources, and of course support groups that is extremely needed for respite for the caregivers and loved ones.
Yeah, and I am hopeful that those who are listening, especially those of you who may be listening who either are caregivers or you're working in law enforcement or healthcare or those spaces where, you need that bit of support, additional support. Thankfully, we have individuals like Brenda Torres-Wells who is actively engaged, but also check into your local agencies if you aren't able to have her specifically to come on, the local support groups that may be available to offer that sense of respite and support. I think it's so key. I love the fact that you mentioned about the ways that we need to show up for those of us who, may be operating as caregivers or know someone who is, but we show up as their guests. I think that's very important. I love that framing.
Yes. And I just like to share a quick story in terms of how someone can look at how to utilize even music as healing, and because music does have power. I did have a resident, Dulcelina, who had dementia, and I served her in New York when I was working in a long term. And her producer, she was a singer, and her producer was Ricky Ricardo from I Love Lucy. His producer was her producer. And so as she was losing her memory, she was also exhibiting agitation, and of course, she was becoming a little impatient with her husband, then her former producer. And in fact, when he was getting care from the nursing staff, she was accusing him of having affairs, and that's usually a sign where they become very suspicious. And so we eventually had to separate both of them for her emotional safety. So I remember that she tried singing certain her songs, but she couldn't remember them. And so I provided her an opportunity to do what we call a music journal. So she was writing some of the lyrics on her journal. And then I told her to just write down anything that she could remember. So even they were fragments of pieces of her songs. So I worked with the Department of Aging because I was also a volunteers coordinator for about 150 volunteers in New York. And so I had a lot of school collaborating with schools. And so I had a group of teenagers from high school and they used to come and volunteer. So I had an adoption agency where they adopted a resident. And so I had her adopted by this young man who was very tech savvy. And I told him, your job is to find those words, put them together, go on YouTube. I don't care what you do, just find that song. And he finally started to look and found some of her songs. So he put him in a device, an iPod shuffler at that time. And I worked with Dan Cohen, who was the founder of Music and Memories. And we had that program going on. And when we put the headsets on her, she just started to sing. And what also ended up happening was that she was an artist. And so her art, just her passion of art just started to come out and just she's just started to freely express herself. And do you know that her painting actually was placed in a contest and it actually won, and then it was circulating in the New York City center, what we call the senior centers, in their
Oh,
lobby. So this was a win-win situation. And I had to co-publish that article in our Leading Age Advantage magazine some years ago because that was a success story. So, what I share with you is the fact that her artwork became so powerful that it was showcased in New York City. But in that moment, she was not a diagnosis, she was an artist. This reminded us that music and art remain deeply embedded in the brain. And when we tap into that, we reconnect with the people we connect the people to themselves. Sometimes that's where the magic happens, okay? Because so many people are disconnected and they feel that they're not connecting anymore, but they do need some what we call help. And that's where a recreation therapist can come in handy as well, but also music therapists.
what an amazing, powerful story. I'm so glad that you shared that. And that's just another example of how we can bring all of those different elements of art, of music, of movement, of fashion. All of those things can be brought together to elevate the perspectives that you shared around her success. That is amazing. And I'm so glad again that you shared that story with us. Thank you.
Of course. I know I bring a multidisciplinary perspective with art, dance, advocacy, and leadership, and I incorporate it into creativity and, of course, in care. So it's not just clinical, it's human.
Yeah, absolutely. And your long-standing credentials around advocacy, around leadership, dance, party promotion, art, music, movement, the fact that you want these to be emotional experiences for those that you serve, and the way that you speak, teach, and train. I know that everyone who has heard you has been truly blessed by your work. And I just hope and pray that you're able to continue to do the work for many, many, many more years.
Thank you so much, Joyce. I just also want to share that, I'm on LinkedIn, and usually what I like to do is share some testimonials, I call it, and some real life stories, so that those that are serving our elderhood, I called it elderhood,
Mhm.
they can also embrace getting some perspective and some ideas. I think it's extremely important.
I do too, and I thank you for that. And I actually jotted that word down to as elderhood. I think that's a beautiful way to address our seniors and those who may be experiencing Alzheimer's and dementia. I think it's beautiful, And as we begin to wind down our time together, one of the things I always like to ask my guests is if they have any additional main points or encouraging words, any tools, resources, just anything that you would want the audience to take away from our Create Yourself conversation today. So the floor is yours to share.
Sure. Well, I like to just share that if there's one thing I want people to understand is that dementia does not erase the person. It changes how we need to show up. And when we shift from task focused to connection focused care, we do not just improve care, we elevate the human experience. And that's the work.
That is absolutely beautiful. I think that's a wonderful way for us to share, unless you have any additional information, tools, resources that you would like to share.
Well, I do have a website and it's www.memorycarellc.com. I do share some resources on some of the practices like time slips and programs that I've been involved in, also facilitate with residents, so that in case there is someone who is working along the lines of as a caregiver to their loved ones, sometimes they don't know what to do, but it's the simplest thing of getting to know their life. I always say you should write a book, start writing now about their wishes, who they are, and what they want. Because eventually, when they become aphasic, because there's stages in dementia, and we have to know that we have mild, moderate, and late stages of dementia. You want to capture your loved ones' stories now when they can still be able to do so, and then work from there. Let them also design what they also want to do in their life.
I like that. That is fantastic advice, words to live by, things. You've given us some very clear action items that we can implement immediately. Always a plus for our listeners, things that they can do right away. I want to ensure that everyone knows, of course, when you clicked on this to listen to the podcast, you were privy to read her bio as well as ways to contact. So please make sure that you go to the website. And she did mention LinkedIn as well. So always to, all the ways that best connect with her, you will be able to do so by clicking the links below our podcast conversation. So with that being said, I would like to just take a moment to thank you for being such a gracious, knowledgeable guest who was willing to pour and share into us about strategies and ways for us to do the work that we're doing in supporting others in a human-centered way. So thank you for your advocacy, for your leadership. Thank you for the ways that you pull together all that you have learned over the years and be able to provide a therapeutic recreational experience for those who need us most.
Thank you, Joyce, for having me and the invitation.
And of course, to our listeners, I want to thank you for showing up because I could not do this podcast without you. So, as I always say, please go forward and create the life that you desire and deserve. And remember that you can do so at any age. Let's continue to transition, transform, and thrive together.